They laughed at the plywood and the fabric. They pointed at the little plane with its crooked bazooka tubes and called it a toy. A fabric-covered observation aircraft, a 65-horsepower engine, and a name scrawled on the fuselage, Rosie the Rocketer, was not what anyone expected to see dive toward a panther or a tiger. But on a fog-choked morning near Aracourt on September 20th, 1944, that same toy plane would fly low enough to set steel alight and change the fate of men pinned down by German armor. Major Charles Carpenter was 32, and before the war, a high school history teacher. In war, became something else, an officer who believed speedier ideas could sometimes beat slower tactics. Stationed with Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, he flew the Piper L-4 Grasshopper, an observation variant of the civilian Piper Cub. It was fragile in every sense the battlefield counted. A fabric wing that could be torn like paper by tracer fire, a slender fuselage that offered little protection, and a tiny engine, 65 horses to drag 2 men in a radio through wind and smoke. Yet that fragility was also its strength. It could creep low and slow over hedgerows where heavier planes could not. The problem America faced that late summer was plain and brutal. Sherman tanks, reliable and numerous, were outgunned and outranged by the latest German designs. Panthers and Tigers could sit back, pick their shots, and punch through Sherman's armor at distances American gunners could not comfortably reach. Artillery was hesitant in the fog. Fighter bombers could not always be vectored in on short notice. Tank crews called their machines steel coffins when the odds stacked against them. On many days, improvisation on the fly, literally, was the only alternative between the lines and catastrophe. Carpenter knew the maps and the menace. He knew too that being a spotter who watched Allied columns die while radioing coordinates to artillery would not be enough. The idea was simple and dangerous. If he could get closer than the tanks expected, present a target outside of the gunner's ideal arc, and launch rockets that could disable a turret or set an engine block on fire, he might split the German advantage. The means to do that existed in the infantry's hands already, the M1 M9 Bazooka, a shoulder-fired rocket launcher that, when launched by a 2-man team, could perforate armor at close ranges. Carpenter's tinkering would be to make that shoulder gun into wing-mounted tubes. Ground crews called his scheme reckless. Pilots from armored spotter units grinned and joked. The bazooka tubes flanking Rosie made the little plane look absurd, like a child's toy pinned with matchsticks. But those jokes hid unease. Mounting rocket tubes beneath an L4 altered lift and drag, threatened the wing's fabric at the points of attachment, and added momentum that the tiny engine and light airframe were not built to carry.
There were also the obvious dangers no manual could account for. Backblast, rockets kicking up muzzle flames within inches of a fabric wing, the risk of a strut being shot by anti-aircraft fire and bringing the whole wing down. The modification itself was deceptively crude. 6 M9 launcher tubes were bolted to the struts and lower longerons, each angled slightly outward to compensate for the fixed mount. No sledgeable turrets here, only fixed tubes and the pilot's aim. The rockets used were M6 shaped charge projectiles. Their warheads could concentrate explosive force to punch through roughly 3.5 to 4 inches of armor under ideal conditions. At the distances Carpenter expected to engage, hundreds of yards closing to a few dozen, the rocket's job was not to pierce main frontal armor from 100 yards, but to strike the sides or rear of a tank, hit a turret joint, or ignite fuel and gasoline. That required getting low, getting close, and exposing the plane to light arms and anti-aircraft fire. Carpenter named his plane Rosie the Rocketer and stenciled the serial number where the unit could confirm it, 4330426. The name was half jest, half talisman. To his mechanics, the plane was a risky patchwork. To the men in the armored columns, it looked like a joke. When he first taxied Rosie across the mud and grass of the makeshift strip, voices rose. "She's a toy," some said. "What will a bazooka do against a tiger?" others snapped. The mockery followed the plane like a cloud, until the morning that fog rolled in off the fields and visibility dropped to a few hundred yards. Fog turned the world small and blinkered. Shapes emerged from gray as dark lumps, then as tanks, squat turrets cutting through low cloud, moving with a predator's patience. On that morning, the Germans held a pocket of Panthers and at least a couple of heavier tanks pushing forward, probing the American flank. Carpenter launched Rosie into the haze because he could not watch the armored column close on American positions and do nothing. The L4 climbed sluggishly in the dense air. Every added pound, the bazooka tubes, ammunition, a second man to reload the tubes, sapped climb rate and speed. The plane's engine, already small for a combat role, worked hard. Carpenter flew close to the trees to disguise approach and used the fog as both shield and hazard. Through a spray of condensation and oil on the windscreen, he picked out the lead tanks, long tubes and rounded mantlets, the silhouettes of Panthers rolling slowly yet confidently. Their crews were trained to expect anti-tank glints from other machines, armor-piercing shots from other tanks, not a bird-like plane with rocket tubes strapped to its sides.
That meant steep diving angles. He nicked the plane over, pitched 20 to 30 degrees nose down and used gravity to bring the trajectories to the tanks. The pilot learned to think of the aircraft as a spear. When he committed, the bazooka mouths would be level with a turret or engine deck at the right moment. Timing and courage did the rest. The first sortie of the morning was brutal in its simplicity. Visibility was poor. The tanks did not expect close aerial intervention. Carpenter found a lead Panther, adjusted his angle, and squeezed the trigger that opened the rocket's firing circuits. Flames licked from the tubes. The rockets left bright arcs, and one struck home, perhaps the engine deck or the rear hull. Witnesses later said the Panther burned, its turret curling black smoke into the fog. Carpenter's first strike did not turn the field by itself, but it did something else more immediate. It stopped a machine, and it startled its comrades. He eased Rosie back to the ground after that run faster than her little engine would have liked. There was a separate urgency on the strip. Reload, refuel if you can, and get back up. The ground crew moved with swift competence. The loader had rehearsed the motions enough to do them in seconds. Rockets were heavy and jagged. Reloading 6 tubes with live projectiles while boots stuck in mud required steady hands. The bazooka tubes themselves were vulnerable. A bad strike could loosen mountings or nick a fuel line. This was not a polished assembly line. It was improvisation under pressure. A quick check showed the plane could take more. The first strike had not shredded Rosie, but the fabric had nicked at the mounting points, and a few rivets looked stressed. Carpenter did not flinch from the risks. He simply knew they had to be calculated. He trusted, perhaps with stubborn faith, the men who stood beside the fuselage and the little engine that had already pulled him from softer decisions. The second sortie found a larger formation. Where there had been 6 Panthers earlier, now there were more, clustered and moving as if searching for a weak point in the American line. Anti-aircraft guns cracked to life as Rosie approached, tracer lines stitched through the fog. Shells that missed Rosie made the air taste of burnt metal. The fabric wings creaked and fluttered as bullets peppered control surfaces. Carpenter felt the plane shudder as small-caliber rounds thudded into ribs and fabric. Cables tightened and frayed under stress. He kept his eyes forward. This time 2 rockets found their mark. One tore into a tank's flank and set a fire that raced up the hull. Another struck a maintenance panel and blew a turret ring. The sight of a Panther burning in that gray light was cinematic and terrible. Black smoke chewing upward, the burnt sheen of paint blistered into darkened scales. Ground observers later described watching a Panther go up as if a torch had been dropped into its belly.
When that tank stopped moving, others hesitated. In the slot between astonishment and reaction, Carpenter swung Rosie for another pass. Wounded by fragments and a concussive force of nearby shell bursts, the plane still held together, but damage accumulated. Tiny holes punctured fabric. The radio worked sporadically. An oil line was nicked and leaked in a slow, foul-smelling spray that blended with fog and smoke to make the cockpit feel like a small engine room on fire. Carpenter's engine shuddered as if coughing. Instrument needles jittered. Every mile per hour the L-4 lost at that point was a mile closer to being unable to climb out of trouble. Back on the ground, a different scene unfolded. Combat Command A had men in a supply water point that were now, according to field reports, isolated. About 20 soldiers manned the water point, non-combat personnel, and a handful of drivers and armor mechanics, who, isolated in a fold of terrain, were suddenly trapped as German tanks closed. They radioed for help, and the messages that came back were terse. The Panthers had the area covered, and ground reinforcements were pinned. The armored columns could not punch through without risking an even bigger engagement, and artillery could not be delivered in accurate bursts through the fog without risking friendly fire. News of the trapped water point filtered out to the airstrip via an uneasy voice on the net. 20 men trapped, closing tanks. The words were laconic but urgent. Time shortened to nothing more than a decision. Carpenter was not a man to watch helplessness rule the sector. He glanced at Rosie, at the wet oil on his instrument panel, at the battered tubes jutting like ribs from the wings. He glanced down at his ground crew, who tightened bolts and handed in fresh rockets with grim faces. They were not speaking of danger so much as of necessity. Before he climbed, someone on the strip muttered the words many had said when they first saw Rosie. "You can't do that. That plane's a toy out there." Carpenter did not answer with defense or denial. He clipped his helmet, felt the cold bit of metal against his cheek, and taxied to the grass edge. To the men watching, his movement looked like stubbornness. To the 20 trapped below, it would look like salvation if the gamble held. If that story is one you want preserved, an early, quiet voice would have said out there on the strip, "Hit like and subscribe." The plea to keep this small record alive fit the mood, an appeal to remember improvisers before the world moved on. The men on the ground did not have followers. They had choices. They chose to trust Carpenter and Rosie once more. The third takeoff was the most dangerous of all because it began with less than full strength and more to lose. Oil pressure had crept lower. A strip of fabric along the port wing flapped where a rivet had given. Carpenter climbed with heavy hands, feeling how the air bit into the ship now.
He had to get below the enemy's effective angle of fire without giving them a clear shot at his vulnerable belly. The fog, which until now had cloaked his approaches, offered new hazards. The same low cloud that hid him could also hide trees and hedgerows that might rip a wing like a razor. As Rosie crept into the gray, the pilot's tasks sharpened. He had to aim the whole plane so the fixed tubes lined up with a moving, armored target. He had to judge distance when depth perception was poor. He had to anticipate anti-aircraft responses, and he had to do it while watching the tachometer creep and the oil temperature rise. Small errors could make a bazooka fail to detonate properly, or could send a rocket into a wing strut. Yet the lives of the men below pressed upon him in a directness the maps could not show. Numbers, names, the weight of their wives and families waiting for them somewhere back in the rear. On approach, he saw the first vehicle, a Panther moving on the flank, apparently disorganized after the earlier strikes. Its turret was turned in his direction, as if to look for the fox in the henhouse. Carpenter nosed over. He could feel the plane wanting to lift. The additional bazooka weight tugged at the controls. He set the aircraft's nose down at a steeper angle than earlier passes, about 30 degrees, so that the rocket's trajectories would intersect the tank's side at the right moment. The little plane became a blunt missile itself, and its pilot trusted the math in his head and the feel of the controls. Rockets licked and screamed. The first salvo sent bright lines into the fog. One slammed into a Panther's engine bay. Flames spattered outward. A second rocket struck a tank's side and detonated its external stores, fuel cans, rations, and an ammunition crate that burned quickly and hot. The blast did not scream through the Panther's armor with the divine inevitability a film might show. Instead, it did the more useful thing, disabling drive, breaking a track, spalling armor plates, and setting things alight in ways that made the crew abandon the machine or render it unserviceable. A roar rose from below that had nothing to do with engines alone. Men cheered, others cursed. The little plane turned for a second approach. The anti-aircraft guns, now awake, thudded sporadically and sent bronze tracer stories into the air. Rosie cooked some of that fire. A hole appeared amidships, small at first, then growing, the fabric now a net with daylight shining through. Carpenter felt a shudder as control cables stretched slightly under the hits. He checked the instruments and saw the oil pressure begin to fall by a hair. He noted without dramatics that an engine bearing was probably suffering. He could have returned then. The plane still flew. His ground crew could patch something marginal, might even refill some oil. But returning would mean leaving 20 men alone in a pocket with German armor closing. The decision for him was not rhetorical.
It was a simple calculus. A little more risk in the air might buy enough chaos on the ground for reinforcements or a safe withdrawal. He set the throttle and climbed low over the hedgerows, looking for angles the tanks would not expect. Where to aim a bazooka-fired rocket from a low plane was a practical question. The rocket's shaped charge warhead worked best when it hit a relatively perpendicular surface at short range, or when it found a seam, hinge, or the non-armored rear of a vehicle. Carpenter sought the engine decks in the rear quarters, the places that would cause mobility kills. A disabled tank could bog down the advance and give time for men to move. The rocket's effective ranges were modest, perhaps a few hundred yards, but at the closer ranges Carpenter aimed for, the chance of a critical hit rose significantly. Each run came with a narrow margin. Too high and the rockets would arc harmlessly, too low and the airframe might snag a wire or a tree. On this pass he had no room for hesitation. He dove again and fired 3 rockets in quick succession. One hit, another glanced off a rear plate, and the third failed to detonate when it struck the dirt in a shallow arc and kicked up a plume. The failures bothered him more than they frightened him. They were reminders of how little certainty there was in such improvisation. From the ground, though, results mattered more than method. Between the first and second runs, more than one Panther was immobilized or set burning. Official recountings later credited Carpenter with disabling tanks that day, and contemporary witnesses sometimes suggested higher totals. Official records would ultimately credit him with 2 Tigers among the tanks he confronted across his career. That careful phrasing mattered because eyewitness tallies sometimes painted a larger, more chaotic picture than the paperwork could lock down. By the time he turned home again after the second set of engagements, Rosie was marked. Holes peppered the fabric, and a few rivets had sheared from stress. Control cables had nicked in spots and frayed. Carpenter's radio squawked reports of movements, German formations shifting northeast, American tanks flanking from the west, but also came an urgent terse message: water point, 20 men, pinned, Panthers closing. That sentence condensed a day's worth of decisions into a single call. Everyone on the strip who heard it felt the same shift in the air.
The decision point had arrived: return to fix Rosie for longer-term flight, or go back up immediately to try to save the 20 men before the tanks could overrun them. The plane's mechanical sympathy argued for the former. The duty to the men and the call of improvisation argued for the latter. Carpenter's face, in photographs taken weeks later by a field correspondent, would show a man tired but unbowed. In that moment on the strip, the features were set with a kind of practical stubbornness rather than theatrical heroism.
He had already risked the plane once. The possibility of losing Rosie loomed. So did the certainty of leaving comrades behind. Within minutes, ground crews worked furiously. They patched a few small holes with canvas and cement, replaced a link or two of cable, and pushed a fresh rack of rockets into the tubes. There were no perfect repairs, only enough to give the engine a chance and the little craft an edge in the fight. Men who had laughed at Rosie before now hurried to strap her into a configuration that might carry one more sortie. Mockery had been replaced by a sober competence born of necessity. Carpenter taxied and lifted again, the mud kicking up behind the little tail as he rotated toward the fog. As he climbed through the low cloud, the air smelled of oil and gunpowder, and his instruments read raggedly. He could hear, faint in the mist, the thump of rotating turret gear and the soft, menacing tread of tracks through wet earth. He felt the plane fight the lift as if it resented the extra weight he had demanded of it. The third or fourth sortie, the exact count blurred at the time because adrenaline compresses perception, would be the pivot that decided whether those trapped men would live to tell of a toy that set steel ablaze. He turned Rosie toward the reported position, and for a moment the fog seemed almost conspiratorial, swallowing the plane in a hush before revealing the silhouettes of armor. The air seemed to hold its breath. The strip behind him was a memory of men leaning forward, their faces tight with hope and dread. Carpenter checked the rockets again with practiced fingers, confirmed the firing circuits, and felt the plane's little heartbeat steady under his palms. What happened next would not only test the limits of an improbable machine, but would test the calculus of improvisation. How much risk to a single pilot and a small aircraft could be justified by the prospect of saving a score of lives? It would ask whether an idea laughed at as a toy could truly become a tool of survival. Rosie's nose dipped, and she slipped lower into the haze, a small black bird carrying the heavy promise of explosive metal. The men on the fields below had a fragile chance, and Carpenter had already committed more than ridicule had anticipated. Rosie slipped lower into the haze, a black smudge against a gray that swallowed distance. Carpenter's hands were steady on the stick, because steady hands were all he had left. The instruments wavered, the oil temperature crept, and the fabric under his knees thrummed with the stress of speed and weight. He had planned runs before, calculated arcs, measured dives, but nothing prepared him for the way this one felt, the way the plane seemed to know it was being asked to do more than its designers ever imagined. Below him, through the thin veil of fog, the ground opened into the pocket where the water point lay, a fold of brown earth and hedgerow, around which panthers prowled like dark, slow animals.
Carpenter aimed not with the reflex of a gunner, but with the arithmetic of a man who had taught young minds how to map a past into lessons. He thought in angles and timing, set the nose, commit the dive, hold the sight line until the rockets left the tubes. The bazooka mounts were fixed, the pilot had to be the turret. As Rosie nosed down to some 30 degrees, he felt the little engine howl in a way that sounded more like protest than power. The first salvo burned like a stuttered comet across the gray. One rocket plunged into a Panther's rear transmission and belched flame. A second ripped a track and exploded external supplies. The sounds from the ground were muffled, shouts turning into ragged cheers, but the effect was immediate. A gap opened between the stunned German crews and the men at the water point. Carpenter pulled up on the stick as quickly as he dared. The L-4, loaded as it was, did not want to climb. It fought hard to regain altitude. The world tilted, cloud, then field, then the black tops of armored vehicles, before he found the sympathetic air again. He banked for another pass. The rockets were finite and heavy. He had to make them count. On the second pass, anti-aircraft fire tightened its net. The enemy had found his pattern and thrown shells to clip the path of the little plane. Tracer laced the fog like an angry seam. Carpenter felt the plane take a blow, a thud against the airframe that sent a spray of dust, and then a tiny, sharp noise as fabric surrendered a thread. The instruments wobbled. One of the bazooka mounts shuddered. a rocket slotted slightly at launch and spat a jagged burn across the underside of the wing. For a heartbeat, Carpenter expected an alarm that did not come. Instead came a rising, very human sound from the ground, the cries and prayers of men who had just seen a gap where none had been. He aimed at a panther that had been trying to turn to block a retreat. From below, the engine bay and rear deck were the right geometry for disablement. An M6-shaped charge warhead at the close ranges he risked did not generally punch hole through frontal armor, but from the rear or flank it could destroy tracks, knock out engines, or start fires that made a tank immobile. One rocket struck flush along the engine deck, and the Panther went black at the seams. Flames took hold of the grills, and a plume of dark smoke shot up, curling into the fog like a flag. That was the moment the waterpoint men used. In the confusion, they scrambled from the ditch line, running low and fast toward safety. The German crews were not a single organism, but made of individuals, and panic is a contagion. The immobilized tanks and the furious, if imprecise, aerial harassment bought the time needed for the nearest American armor and infantry elements to close and extract the isolated group.
20 men scrambled away from the hedgerow toward friendly lines. One later medic's report would say they were dazed, bewildered, and smelling of smoke, but alive. Carpenter's last run of the sequence was a blur of noise and flame. On a low, hard pass, a rocket's blast tossed debris, and in the chaos, a tracer or shrapnel nicked the oil line feeding the engine. Carburetor sputter turned into a cough, then a steady choking. The tachometer began to cling to a lower reading. The engine seized with the gracelessness of a man who was run out of breath. Up there in the cramped cockpit, Carpenter felt it as a sudden loss of thrust, as the air turned heavy with the smell of burning oil and the metallic tang of damage. He feathered the controls and looked for a field. To glide an L4 without power is to bargain with angles and everything you can see. Hedgerows become knives, and misjudging a fence can flip a plane into a ruin. He calculated one final arc, a shallow, controlled descent toward a fallow plot bordered by a slender hedge and a drainage ditch. Rosie responded, if obedient only to force and practice. The landing was not graceful. The little plane came in fast and hard, the damaged undercarriage biting into muck. The tail rose as the fuselage slowed, and the momentum flipped Rosie onto her back in a tumble of fabric and mud. The propeller snapped, the tubes crumpled. The aircraft wrote off itself in a sentence of wood and canvas. Carpenter crawled free, sticky with oil and smelling of smoke, his uniform ragged, but himself largely intact. Bruises, a cut here and there. Shock kept at bay by the business of survival. He had no time to indulge in relief. Men ran to him from the hedgerow, hauling him from the wreck and dragging him toward the nearest aid. A medic checked him with quick competence. There would be pain to deal with later, stitches and a dull ache from the tumble, but nothing that would keep him from flying again, if flying again was possible for Rosie. For the moment, a wreck lay where a plane had been, smoking its last piquant fumes into the damp air. Rosie's fate was sealed that day. The airframe was beyond practical repair in the field. The little craft that had once earned jibes was now a burnt-out proof of something else, an idea that could alter a local fight. Official paperwork recorded a write-off. The entry read like many in war logs, clinical and small against the human rain of the day. Carpenter stepped away from the remains and into another role, the role of the man who had done what he could. He had saved 20 lives that afternoon by sheer willingness to accept risk. He had not, and never would, claim to have won a battle by himself. Improvisation had bought time. Allies closed the gap and brought the trapped men to safety. Field reports and later accounts tried to put numbers on the day's events. Contemporary witnesses suggested that more tanks were hit or burned than the official line would state.
The fog, the smoke, and the frenzy of ground movement all compressed events into overlapping impressions. Archivists and historians would later parse after-action reports and witness statements and found a consistent core. Carpenter's strikes immobilized several German tanks. His actions allowed the waterpoint crew to escape. The L4 took lethal damage and was lost. Across Carpenter's career, official records credited him with 2 Tigers among the targets he engaged, language chosen precisely because eyewitness testimony sometimes suggested higher tallies across several combats. The disciplined historian's voice insisted on that distinction. Paper and memory rarely match perfectly in war. What could be stated without qualification was this: his improvisations had a measurable, life-saving effect that day. After Rosie was written off, Carpenter did not retire from the air. he continued to fly observation missions, using other L-4s and sometimes different aircraft, conducting outings that bordered on the same experimental edge as Rosie's modifications had done. Records indicate he flew dozens more sorties. Some accounts list a sequence of more than 60 similar missions where he maintained the same daring blend of reconnaissance and improvised offense. Each flight carried risk. Each flight added a line to a ledger of experience that would influence how observation aircraft were employed and defended. German doctrine took notice too. Enemy commanders became more alert to low, slow planes and placed a higher premium on their protection. That reactive measure spoke to the reality of Carpenter's impact. A single pilot, using a small, improvised weapon system, had forced opponents to adjust their tactics. In the months and years after the incident, Carpenter's career continued, subject to the churn of war assignments. He served in various capacities, and at one point flew for higher command, an assignment that placed him in proximity with senior officers and gave him a different vantage on the war he had helped shape in small, risky ways. He flew as a personal pilot to General John S. Wood on certain missions, an assignment that reflected both his skill and the confidence officers placed in his judgment. It was not the same as strapping bazookas to a fabric wing, but it was another seal in a life of service. War left its marks on him beyond the busted airframe and the temporary scars. It carved memories and restraints into a man who had once been a high school history teacher. He returned home to a quieter professional life and to family, his wife Elda and their daughter Carol, who became the center of a life that shifted from combat reports to the ordinary duties of peacetime. He remarried the world of small civil rhythms, teaching, community, the steady business of returning to the small lessons of life. Yet the war never fully receded from memory.
He stayed in touch with veterans, accepted invitations to reunions, and answered questions from journalists and historians who wanted to know what a man with a toy plane and some bazookas had been thinking on those fog-choked mornings. He answered without drama. Members of his family would later say that he was matter-of-fact about risk and outcome, the kind of man who did not lean toward romanticizing the past. Decades later, the story of Rosie had a second life through paper, photographs, and the stubborn work of researchers. Aviation historians traced serial numbers and maintenance logs, and through a mixture of archival digging and forensic comparison, identified an airframe as the one that had worn the name Rosie the Rocketer, serial 4330426. That identification, made public in 2017, unlocked a renewed interest in Carpenter's exploits. The airframe, found in vintage aircraft circles, was purchased in 2018 by enthusiasts intent on restoration and preserving a tangible link to a small, improvisational chapter of the war. Restoration work sought to conserve what remained and to present the machine in a way that honored the record without overstating claims about provenance. Keeping close to documents and markings, restorers and historians published their findings and made the story available to a new generation. Carpenter's later life was also marked by health struggles that many veterans face. He received a diagnosis of Hodgkin's disease some years after the war. The prognosis at the time carried a gravity that hung over his family. Still, the arc of his life did not end on that medical paper. Against expectations, he lived much longer than some early assessments suggested. He walked a long road beyond the initial diagnosis, a life that included family, quiet honor, and occasional return to the public stage when the memory of that foggy September day needed telling. His longevity did not make the risk he took any less costly. It made his story available to be told and retold, examined by historians, and appreciated by people who had never seen a hedge-lined French field. The moral contours of Carpenter's story resisted tidy summation. He was not a cinematic, mythic figure who single-handedly altered the course of campaigns. He was rather a man who understood that sometimes the difference between a successful withdrawal and a massacre was measured in minutes and inches. How low a plane might fly, how close a rocket might land to a tank seam, how quick a decision could be made under fogged nerves and noisy engines. The ethic that drove him was practical. Save lives if you can, accept risk if necessary, and leave the tally of glory to papers and cautious historians. War stories are littered with improvisation born of necessity. What distinguished Carpenter's effort was its visible, immediate result. Rosie's runs bought time, and in that particular action, bought life.
The plane that had been mocked as a toy had become, for a span of hours, an instrument that burned tanks and altered a local fight. Afterwards, the little aircraft lay ruined in a field, a cautionary tale in canvas and snapped strut. Yet its legacy traveled beyond the wreck. Veterans spoke of the man who refused to watch. Historians wrote the tactical footnotes that made sense of the strike's geometry, and restorers rebuilt a physical reminder for museums and air shows.
The mockery became memory. The jest became a lesson in courage's utilitarian side. There were costs. For every life saved, there was the constant risk of not returning, and for every daring act, the slow accrual of wear and damage that would eventually ground a man or a machine. Carpenter paid those costs in broken airframes, in scars that never quite healed, and in the quiet knowledge that luck and competence had sat side by side that morning. He never asked to be mythologized. He wanted the facts known, the names remembered, and the practical lesson retained. Sometimes a small innovation, carried by a single person willing to risk, can change the outcome for many. Historians continue to debate the exact numbers that day, the counts of tanks hit, whether some were Panthers or Tigers, how many were destroyed outright, and how many merely balked. Official records would later credit Carpenter with 2 Tigers among tanks he engaged across his wartime missions. Eyewitnesses at Aracourt sometimes suggested higher totals in the fog and smoke of battle. That distinction is important. It preserves the rigor of historical method without denying the scale of the human impression left by the event. The truth sits in both places, in the paper ledger and in the soil-stained memories of the men who ran when the little plane screamed across the fog. Carpenter's story holds another lesson about remembrance itself. For years, the tale circulated in fragment, an anecdote told at reunions, a photograph shared in scrapbooks, a paragraph in a regimental history. It took the patient work of archivists and the curiosity of restorers to stitch those fragments into a narrative that could be publicly examined. When Rosie the Rocketer was identified, restored, and shown to new audiences, the joke made at the plane's expense evaporated. What had been mockery was replaced by respect. People saw a machine whose very existence had forced both sides to rethink assumptions. The aircraft's survival as an artifact, partial, restored, and annotated, allowed questions to be asked and answered that would otherwise have been lost to the damp and the decades. In the end, the image that most stayed with those who told the story was not the bazooka tubes or the black smoke rising from a Panther's engine. It was of a small, ragged plane sliding through fog with a man who refused to do nothing.
That decision, made in seconds and executed in the cramped, oil-scented cockpit of an unlikely weapon, had cascading consequences: lives preserved, tactics reconsidered, a plane rusted into legend, and later rescued by people determined to keep memory honest. They had laughed at plywood and burlap, at a plane that looked like a toy. But mockery is a poor judge of consequence. A child's toy can break a parent's heart when a child is hurt. In Carpenter's case, the toy plane burned steel and bowed strategy, becoming for a time both weapon and witness. The laughter turned to silence and then to respect, as survivors told their stories, and historians laid them alongside after-action reports. Carpenter's later years were lived with the humility of a man who had sat too close to danger and learned that survival is never owed. He raised a family, answered questions about tactics and mechanics, and watched as restorers and historians traced the threads of his improvisation into the broader tapestry of the war. Rosie the Rocketer, serial 4330426, found a second life in museums and restorations, not to glorify violence, but to hold a concrete reminder of the strange ways war forces invention. If the moral of the story needs a final line, it might be this: ingenuity can be a lifeline. It can look foolish until it becomes necessary. Major Charles Carpenter was not reckless for spectacle. He was willing to bear the costs of action to save others. The mockery the plane once drew was the thin, brittle thing it had always been: temporary noise. What remained was a record of what one man and a patched-together machine could accomplish when the moment required it. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below. Where are you watching from? Or do you have family who served? Share it with someone who values the overlooked corners of history. Remembering these acts keeps the lessons alive, and it honors the lives they preserved.